All right, thanks for coming back to the Exporter Sports Talk Show. Been having a great show so far in our first fantasy football rankings, where we took a look at our tight ends and our defense special teams. Now let's take it over to the kickers. And as I mentioned before the commercial break, the kickers are very underrated. I could tell you from experience, though, some of these kickers can get you 10 to 15, 18 points, a game. Now, not every single game, but certainly a lot of these top tier kickers can definitely get you double digits in fantasy football on a weekly basis. And that is certainly an underrated matchup where those couple points could help your team out. Now, obviously, in fantasy football, you want to go with the kickers on the top-rated teams. But I'm going to tell you, there's a little bit of conflict and dilemma here. This makes it a little tricky with fantasy football. Now, we want the kickers who are going to give us the most points, no question, okay? And so, obviously, the kicker for Denver, the kicker for New England, New Orleans, these top-scoring teams, of course you want them on your fantasy football team. But if those teams are scoring a bunch of touchdowns, then the kicker is doing nothing but getting a bunch of extra points, as opposed to maybe being on a team like the Baltimore Ravens or the San Diego Chargers, who get in the field goal range and scoring position on a regular basis, but they settle for field goals instead of extra points. And that's what you want. You want your kicker to kick field goals. So let's go ahead and delve in. Like I said, common sense to tell you, we still have to rate the highest scoring teams' kickers first. So Matt Prater, he's out with the Denver Broncos, led the NFL in scoring last year. The Broncos offense did. So obviously he was handcuffed to that situation and really excelled. Next, Stephen Gostkowski. He's out in New England. New England puts up a ton of points. Next, you have Nick Novak. He's out in San Diego. Definitely had a great season last year. Next, you have Stephen Hauschka of the Seattle Seahawks. Led the NFL kickers in scoring last year. He's certainly a guy with that tough defense. The Seahawks definitely move the ball. They keep great field position. Hauschka is certainly underrated, but a guy you want to have on your fantasy football team. You have Adam Vinatieri out in Indianapolis. The Colts get in the field goal range an awful lot. Shane Graham should certainly excel being a kicker for the New Orleans Saints. Robbie Gould has been steady for so long out in Chicago. They have a real explosive offense this year. Nick Freese out in Detroit. The Lions move the ball a lot. This guy will certainly have an opportunity to do his thing. You have Matt Crosby for the Green Bay Packers. Has been a little inconsistent the last couple years, but I think he finally has kind of regained his confidence after making some key field goals last year. Green Bay is going to score a lot of points. Alex Henry out in Philadelphia. Certainly expect for the Eagles to move the football. This guy can be a valuable resource to your football team. You have Phil Dawson. I think this is a real underrated guy out for the San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers are going to move the football. I certainly expect for Phil Dawson to have a nice year and be a great asset to your fantasy football team. And then you have a couple guys who are booming that football out of the stadium, even though their teams aren't the best. Blair Walsh for the Minnesota Vikings. He's good from about 55 yards. Sebastian Janikowski just watched the preseason game yesterday against the Detroit Lions. From 55 yards out, straight down the middle, no problem. This guy is probably good from about 60 yards. And then Greg Zuerlein out in St. Louis. He's another guy, I would say 50 to 55 yards. He's accurate. And then Kai Forbath is a guy out in Washington that you want to watch for. I certainly expect for the Redskins offense to bolster a lot of points this year. He could be a guy, could be a great asset to your football team. Now, those are the top tier guys. So no matter if you're in a 10, 12, or 14, sometimes I've even seen fantasy football as deep as 16 men to a league. There's no reason whatsoever you shouldn't be able to get your hands on a good fantasy football kicker this year. Now we're going to move into our second tier guys. And like I said, these guys are just not on the top scoring teams in the NFL, but that is not a negative considering if their team gets in the field goal range, this guy can certainly cash in. And a lot of these players I'm going to mention from last year did certainly that. I'm starting off with Ryan Suckup out in Kansas City. The Chiefs stayed moving the ball and were unable to capitalize with touchdowns. This guy racked up on a ton of field goals last year. Justin Tucker out in Baltimore, similar situation. The Ravens get in field goal position a lot, and Tucker is certainly a guy who can take advantage of that. I recall a game last year in Detroit where he kicked 6 field goals. That's 18 points that he was able to give his team. You certainly love that in your fantasy football lineup. You have Mike Nugent out in Cincinnati. We certainly expect the Bengals to be able to move the ball this year. Sean Swisham out in Pittsburgh. You certainly expect Big Ben to keep his team in field goal position. Graham Gano out for the Carolina Panthers. That Panthers offense doesn't look too explosive, especially passing their football. You would expect for them to have a lot of field goal opportunities. Connor Bowen out in Tampa Bay. You also have Matt Bryan for the Atlanta Falcons. They expect for the Falcons to stay in field goal position. You have Jay Philly out in Arizona and Dan Bailey out in Dallas, a couple teams that have some pretty high scoring offenses there. You know, they move the ball quite a bit. Caleb Sturgis, he's with the Miami Dolphins. Dan Carpenter and Nick Folk, both those teams, the Jets and the Bills, have second-year quarterbacks. Would expect for them to have a lot of field goal opportunities. Billy Cundiff out in Cleveland. You also have Randy Bullock out in Houston. Josh Scobie for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's been a steady guy over the years. And then Brett Kern out in Tennessee. And so as I mentioned, and of course Josh Brown for the New York Giants as well. And so as I mentioned here, it's really about, now I'm going to tell you, with defense and special teams and kickers, one of the strategies that I've used over the past couple years, if I don't get an elite defense and a kicker, there's more than enough depth. But especially if I don't get me an elite defense, what I like to do is from week to week, based on matchup, I'll interchange out my defense and my kickers based on matchup. And so that's a nice strategy to have. You know, if you don't get your hands on an elite defense, you maybe don't get your hands on the kicker that you want, you certainly can look at the matchups week to week, maybe find a defense is playing against a weak quarterback or a backup quarterback, and maybe find a kicker who's is playing a tough defense where the offense will move the ball but not score a lot of touchdowns. All right? Once again, NFL Exporter Raw Radio. You're listening to the Exporter Sports Talk Show. Don't touch that dial. When we come back from commercial break, we're going to talk about some trending and relevant topics that's going on in fantasy football right now as we're 2 weeks into the preseason.
Ladies and gentlemen. God damn it!